Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now, today's video is actually a follow-on to our film about the Enon Chapel in London in the Victorian times, where 12,000 bodies were buried underneath. This is the story of London's notorious burial grounds, and I must warn you now, these are pretty gruesome stories. The sad thing is, though, they're all true. Something I didn't realise was if you go back a little bit in history into London, early Victorian and before then, London was full of not just churchyards, but private burial grounds that were run by some of the most unscrupulous people you could ever wish to meet. But if you wander around London, like I often do when I'm back home, you'll come across courtyards, gardens, children's playgrounds. These were actually once burial grounds that contain the bodies of tens of thousands of Londoners. Do you know, we would have known very little about these burial grounds and churchyards of old London town if it hadn't have been for a middle-class Victorian lady called Mrs. Holmes. She must have had a fascination with maps. She was looking at Roke's map of London, the old map of London, and noticed that there were 362 burial grounds in London, 41 of which were still in use, and 90 which had become public gardens and playgrounds. So she embarked on a journey of discovery. She went to visit them, but she came a little bit unstuck because remember, this is a middle-class Victorian lady going into the notorious slum areas of London. She ended up being pelted with mud on more than one occasion, but it's through her we know exactly where these burial grounds, boneyards if you like, still lie to this very day. We also have reports and publications from George Alfred Walker, known as George Graveyard Walker. He wrote the book Gatherings from the Graveyards, where he surveyed 47 burial places within London. It's quite incredible when you look into this, because by 1842, life expectancy in London, now this is London particularly, if you're a professional worker in London, your life expectancy, 30 years of age. If you were just a common labourer, your life expectancy, 17 years of age. This was due to lack of nutrition, disease, poor sanitation, overcrowding. And what the knock-on effect was, there was less and less space in London to actually bury the incredible large amount of dead. Now, I've got a table for the proper interment of a body in a coffin. And it's quite something, yeah, obviously 6 foot down or thereabouts. 1 foot 3 inches is allowed in between each coffin. But the top and tail, the head and foot, there should be at least a foot between you and the next coffin. And you must allow 10 years for complete decomposition before you rotate that grave. But you've got to understand, at this time, so we're talking 1842, the population of London had exploded. There's 2 million people. This had really accelerated after the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, just in case you didn't know. London had become a centre for commerce, all that kind of stuff. But now you've got this real problem. So if that's 2 million people, that's a death rate of 50,000 people a year. Now, if you take into consideration that it takes 4 children to fill an adult grave, you will need 500,000 burial plots every 10 years in London. So this now opens up the market for the unscrupulous undertakers who will now exploit this little bit of a niche in the market for burial plots. This is the beginning of the scandals of the boneyards of London. As I've mentioned, there was a correct way to bury your dead and to rotate them, that 10 years kind of thing. But in the private burial grounds and indeed the churchyards of early Victorian London, there just wasn't the space. So your unscrupulous sextons and your private burial ground operatives, your undertakers, they used to rotate the dead quickly. They kept it a secret, but the secret came out, and this is what they used to do. You come along, you bury your dearly departed, off you go. within 2 days, they will dig up your dearly departed, crack open the coffin. Now the coffin will be stripped down. The tin nameplate will be taken off. The nails will be taken out and recycled. And the coffin wood will be used to either shore up the deep grave pits. Some of these grave pits went down 20 to 30 feet. The rest of the wood, the splinters and the bits that are broken off, will be used as firewood in the domestic houses of the boneyard managers. Now the body, now remember this body's only been down there for a couple of days or for a few weeks, will be dragged with rope to the bottom end of the boneyard where they will be cut up, literally chopped up, and then thrown down into bone pits covered with quicklime to decompose. This was all done under the cover of darkness, or sometimes they put tarpaulin along the railings of these burial pits to hide it from the public. However, the secrets got out. So going back to George Walker's book, there's actually a report of a coroner's inquest for a death of a grave digger, 1838, Aldgate Church Passage. His name was John Oakes, and he was 20 feet down into a grave pit. Now, it's simple to say he's 20 feet down, but in fact, he'd cut in between 2 rows of graves. So either side of him, there were stacks of coffins. When he got to the bottom, he'd passed out. Now, Edward Luddett, a fishmonger who was a nearby witness, he volunteered to be lowered down. So he was lowered down the grave, and when he gets to the bottom, he bends down to put the ropes under the shoulders of John Oakes, and he collapses dead, as if he'd been hit by a cannonball, one of the witnesses said. Now, another gravedigger, William King, had 2 or 3 attempts to try and get down the grave, but the stench, the air was so foul he couldn't do it. They had to wait a further half an hour before they could lower hooks down and hook the bodies and drag them back up. So what was wrong with the air? As you probably know, a decomposing human body gives off gases. These gases are called cadaverine and putrescine, and these are responsible for the dead body smell. These gases are toxic, especially in large amounts, but there are other gases that can be given off, such as carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide. Now, the first 2 of these gases will suffocate you, but the last one is poisonous, especially in confined areas. Do you know, there's a saying that comes from this time, the stinking rich. So if you're wealthy enough, you're not buried in a churchyard, you're actually placed in an airtight coffin, lead-lined, and then you're put into the crypt or to the cellars of the church. But of course, as you decompose, the gases will expand that coffin, and very often they would burst, and the stench that would come out there from this putrefaction would be disgusting. And of course, it would then waft up from down below up to the congregation as they were there on a Sunday, and it would stink. Yes, they could smell the stinking rich. So we're going to recount some of the stories contained in George Walker's book. The first one is regarding the Crossbones burial ground. So this is a private burial ground. 1845, Marion Gwilt, a teacher at a school that backed on to the burial ground. Now you must understand, these burial grounds were often sided by houses. So you could only go in one direction through the gates, or sometimes even in an archway in between the houses. So they were fully contained. And what had been happening is that the burials had actually increased the level of the ground 4 feet. So the level of the cemetery now came to just under the kitchen window of the school. But the main part of her complaints are quite incredible. Bodies left out in the open. Graves left open, not filled in. Cholera victims, some women who died from cholera, were left for days just adjacent to the school windows. So Marion Gwilt writes a letter of complaint to the Board of Health, and they ignore it. It's not till much later, when there is another complaint, that action is taken and the cemetery is eventually closed down. But can you imagine those children at school, what they could see through the windows, and the people who lived around these boneyards, the stench, those poisonous gases escaping from the ground? So I've got a little story here of a burial ground just on the north side of Drury Lane. It's within the parish of St Martin's in the Field. And I find this quite incredible. As I mentioned, many of these burial pits were enclosed with houses all the way around, or the backs of the houses. Now, they didn't have backyards, these houses. They were just the flat terraced kind of houses. And what had happened is this burial ground had become so overcrowded that as they put coffins on top of coffins and then just covered them with earth, that what had been level with the ground of the houses, or just below the ground level, had suddenly overtaken, until in the end, the height of the ground was above the ground floor windows of the houses. So the people who lived in the houses had to put wooden defences outside of their back windows on the ground floor to stop coffins bursting through their window. This became so bad that the managers of the burial ground realised they'd got to build a defence to stop this happening. So they decided to build a brick wall around so that coffins didn't slide through the windows, the ground floor windows of the houses. But then they had to dig foundations. So you imagine the soil, what it contained. So instead of doing it discreetly of a night time and taking it away to wherever, they piled it up outside their burial ground, awaiting for wagons, and people could see the human remains that were contained within that soil. This was just one of the scandals that came out of the private burial grounds of Victorian London. Another story we have that was reported in George Walker's book is the Spa Fields, the notorious burial ground in London. Now, this ground, just 2 acres, was leased from the Marquis of Northampton in 1777. It was calculated that within that 2 acres, you could bury 2,722 bodies. Fine, except that they didn't. 1,500 bodies per year, and they reckon by the time it was closed that it contained, just 2 acres, 80,000 dead. Now, I've explained to you before how they used to rotate the dead, but in Spa Fields, the bone pits didn't just contain bones. These are decomposing, chopped up remains. And the gases that were being given off one night ignited, and there was a raging fire. So the fire brigade had to be called. And what their fire chief witnessed in burning bones and flesh was, of course, reported. The scandal breaks. In 1814, there was a parliamentary report about the overcrowding state of Spa Fields and how there just wasn't any more room for burials. However, you could always get a grave there. You know, it wasn't just the private burial grounds that exploited these bereaved with these funerals. The churches themselves, with their churchyards, they weren't above their unscrupulous behaviour when it came to the bereaved and to the funerals. You take St Margaret's Church, right next to Westminster Abbey, across the road from the Houses of Parliament. That churchyard was so full, bits of coffin could be seen sticking up out the ground. The water supply, there was a water pump in that cemetery, had been contaminated by the putrefaction of the bodies, but also the graves went right up to the very walls of Westminster Abbey. Now, if you go there today, it's a beautiful, nice piece of green lawn, and you can go and have a picnic on it, but you don't realise there are thousands of dead underneath it. But you look at Hanover Square in London, very, very upmarket part of the world, and some of the funerals there would have been very elaborate, very expensive, especially at St George's Church there. So there you are, you're well-to-do, uncle has died, big funeral, nice gravestone. You have purchased that grave in perpetuity. It's yours until the end. And you go away for high tea or whatever after the funeral. Meanwhile, the sexton and the gravedigger are waiting, chinking silver coins in their pockets, and they will have your uncle dug up and relocated to the far end of the churchyard where all the poor people are buried, and they will resell your grave. Now you may come along a couple of days later, there is a fresh grave. And there is your gravestone. And you will say a few words over your uncle, but it won't be him. One of the saddest accounts in this whole business is the account at St Giles in the Field churchyard. It was from the Weekly Dispatch, September 1838. Now, witnesses went along to this churchyard. This is consecrated ground. This is not a private burial ground tucked away. This is a churchyard. One of the first things they see is one of the grave diggers with a barrel full of coffin wood, all chopped up, and some of the coffin plates all shiny and new. So they question him, and he's quite negative. But the worst is yet to come. They then walk down, further down the cemetery, to the bone pits. And there they see chopped up bits of bodies, severed heads still with hair attached, and human bones with flesh still attached. This is worse than any horror movie you can ever imagine. But as they're leaving, they see another grave digger, drunk. They must have had to be to do what they were doing. He's opened up a grave. Now these witnesses, they look down the grave and they're almost overpowered by the stench coming out of the ground. So they held their breath and peered down into the grave, and there they saw a child's coffin that had been split lengthways. But the child's body was contained in the part of the coffin that remained. It was still wrapped in its shroud, which had barely decayed. So to finish off our stories, I have a bit of a macabre story which I found amusing, but that's my dark sense of humour. St Clement Danes Churchyard in London, a grave digger is in an overcrowded cemetery. He's opening up a new grave. What he doesn't realise is he's actually standing on top of a coffin, just a couple of inches of earth between him and the coffin lid. And as he's digging down, the whole side of these coffins actually collapses. He's thrown into the grave as the coffin tips over and the corpse spills out, lands on top of him in the grave, and the corpse's hands literally are thrown around the neck of the grave digger. I'll tell you what, you'll need more than one trip to the pub to get over that shock. You know, when I was doing the research for this film, I came across what the Parisians did, what the government of Paris did in 1786, when they relocated the dead, the people who'd been buried within the city limits of Paris. Their bones down into the catacombs. You can go and visit them if you want to. And then the more complete bodies to the new cemeteries on the outskirts of Paris. Why on earth didn't the City of London take note of this? It wasn't until 1852 with the Metropolitan Burial Act that burials within the City of London came to an end. Now that was down to the tireless campaigning for Sir Edwin Chadwick and of course George Graveyard Walker. But there had been so much resistance to this. The clergy, the owners of the graveyards. And I know why. It's quite simple really. There was money to be made. So if you find yourself walking around the streets of London, keep an eye out when you come across a bit of green space. You might find a gravestone or an abandoned tombstone where the names have faded. These are what's left of some of the burial grounds, some of the churchyards that have been lost. But there are others buried now underneath buildings, schools, office blocks, car parks, even railways and railway arches. And the people buried beneath? Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and all those identities are lost because now they lie in unmarked graves. Well, I hope you found that interesting, our digging into the past of London. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, why don't you have a look at our Patreon page? The link is in the description. But before I go, I'd like to say a big thanks to some of our new Patreon members, Kevin N, Gordon Banks and Daniel Cork. Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.